the world knew Elvis Presley as the king of rock and roll, the man who changed music forever with his hips and his voice. But what most people never knew was that Elvis believed he wasn't entirely from this world. On a cold night in January 1935, as Gladys Presley screamed through labor pains in a tiny two-room shack in Tupelo, Mississippi, something strange appeared in the sky above that shotgun house. Vernon Presley stood outside, helpless and terrified, watching his wife struggle to bring life into the world. Then he saw it, a brilliant blue light hovering over the house, pulsing like a heartbeat, unlike anything he'd ever seen before. Years later, when Elvis became famous, Vernon would tell anyone who'd listen about that light. He believed it was a sign. He believed something otherworldly had touched his son the moment he entered this world. And Elvis, he believed it too, because 8 years later, in that same small town, young Elvis Presley would have an encounter that would shape everything he believed about himself, about his destiny, and about forces beyond our understanding. But before we dive deeper into this incredible story, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more untold stories about the legends of rock and roll. That night in Tupelo wasn't just the birth of Elvis Aaron Presley. It was the death of his twin brother, Jesse Garon, who never took a single breath. The midwife wrapped the stillborn infant in newspapers because the Presley family couldn't afford a proper blanket. Vernon buried his son in an unmarked grave the next day while Gladys held Elvis close, convinced that her surviving son carried the soul of both twins. This tragedy would haunt Elvis for his entire life, creating a void inside him that he would spend decades trying to fill with music, fame, spiritual seeking, and a desperate search for meaning beyond the material world. Vernon's story about the blue light planted the first seed of something even stranger in young Elvis's mind. His father told him repeatedly throughout his childhood that he was special, that he had been marked by something greater, that the light in the sky had chosen him for a purpose nobody could yet understand. Elvis grew up dirt poor in Tupelo, so poor that his family sometimes ate nothing but cornbread and beans for weeks at a time. But Elvis was a strange child, quiet and introspective, often staring at the stars for hours while other children played. Gladys noticed that her son seemed to be listening to something she couldn't hear, watching something she couldn't see. When she asked him what he was thinking about, young Elvis would say things that disturbed her. He talked about lights in his room at night, about feelings of being watched by benevolent presences, about dreams where he saw himself on stage in front of thousands of people wearing clothes that didn't exist yet in 1940s Mississippi. In 1943, when Elvis was 8 years old, something happened that he would only discuss decades later with his closest confidants. He was walking alone near the woods outside Tupelo when he saw two figures made entirely of light standing among the trees. These weren't human beings. They had no distinct features, no faces, no clothing, just pure luminous forms that seemed to pulse with an energy Elvis could feel in his chest. He wasn't afraid. In fact, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace and recognition, as if he had known these beings his entire life. Without speaking a single word out loud, Elvis felt communication happening directly in his mind. The beings showed him visions, images of himself as an adult, dressed in a white jumpsuit covered in jewels, standing on a stage with lights blazing and thousands of people screaming his name. They showed him guitars, microphones, stages, fame beyond anything a poor boy from Mississippi could imagine. And then they showed him something else. Images of other worlds, other civilizations, the vastness of space, and the idea that Earth was just one small piece of an infinite cosmic puzzle. When Elvis finally returned home hours later, his mother was frantic, but Elvis couldn't explain where he had been or what he had seen. The words didn't exist in his 8-year-old vocabulary to describe beings of light, communicating telepathically about his cosmic destiny, so he said nothing. But from that day forward, Elvis was different. He became obsessed with the night sky, with questions about what existed beyond the stars, with a burning certainty that his life had a purpose connected to something far greater than Tupelo, Mississippi. When a music teacher finally put a guitar in his hands when he was 11, something clicked into place. The visions the light beings had shown him started to make sense. This was the path. This was the destiny they had revealed. By 1954, Elvis had recorded his first single at Sun Records in Memphis. and within 2 years, he had become the most famous and controversial entertainer in America. Ed Sullivan's producers famously instructed cameramen to only film Elvis from the waist up during his television appearance, terrified that his hip movements would corrupt America's youth. What nobody knew was that behind the leather jacket and the rebellious persona, Elvis was conducting a very different kind of rebellion, a spiritual revolution in his own mind. He had never forgotten the beings of light he saw as a child, and as his fame grew, so did his conviction that his success was connected to forces beyond normal human understanding. He started reading everything he could find about mysticism, ancient religions, UFOs, and paranormal phenomena. His dressing rooms were packed with books by Helena Blavatsky, Manly P. Hall, Paramahansa Yogananda, and dozens of obscure authors writing about cosmic consciousness and extraterrestrial contact. In 1964, everything changed when Elvis met Larry Geller, a young hairdresser who would become far more than someone who styled his hair. Geller walked into Elvis's dressing room for what was supposed to be a simple haircut appointment. But within minutes, the two men were engaged in a deep conversation about the meaning of life, the nature of consciousness, and the possibility of life beyond Earth. Elvis was electrified. For the first time in his adult life, he had found someone who didn't think he was crazy for his beliefs. Geller became Elvis's spiritual advisor, confidant, and window into a world of metaphysical knowledge that the king of rock and roll had been desperately seeking since childhood. Over the next 13 years, until Elvis's death in 1977, Geller would introduce him to meditation techniques, Eastern philosophy, Kriya Yoga, and a vast library of books about subjects that would shock most of Elvis's fans. What shocked Geller, however, was discovering that Elvis's interest in these subjects wasn't just intellectual curiosity. Elvis genuinely believed he had been in contact with non-human intelligence multiple times throughout his life, and he was convinced that his fame and influence were part of a larger cosmic plan. During one of their early conversations, Elvis pulled out a worn notebook filled with drawings and notes he had been keeping since childhood. Sketches of the light beings he saw in Tupelo, descriptions of dreams where he received messages about humanity's future, and detailed accounts of strange lights he had seen in the sky over the years. Geller realized he wasn't dealing with a celebrity having a midlife crisis. Elvis Presley had been on a genuine spiritual quest his entire life, driven by experiences that most people would dismiss as hallucinations or childish fantasies. But Geller believed him, and soon Geller would witness things with Elvis that would convince him beyond any doubt. In 1965, Elvis and Larry Geller were driving through the Arizona desert, late at night, returning from a spiritual retreat where they had spent days meditating and discussing the nature of consciousness. The highway was empty, the desert vast and dark under a sky filled with more stars than either man had ever seen. Elvis was driving, talking enthusiastically about a book he had just finished about ancient astronaut theory, when suddenly both men saw lights in the sky that made them fall silent. These weren't planes. These weren't helicopters or satellites or shooting stars. 3 distinct points of light were moving across the sky in formation, executing turns and maneuvers that defied everything Geller knew about physics. The lights would stop instantly, change direction at impossible angles, accelerate to speeds that seemed to violate the laws of motion, and then hover completely still before moving again. Elvis pulled the car over to the side of the empty highway, and both men got out, standing in the cold desert night, watching these lights perform their impossible dance for nearly 20 minutes. Neither man spoke while it was happening. When the lights finally disappeared over the horizon, Elvis turned to Geller with tears streaming down his face. He said something that Geller would never forget. "They're watching us, Larry. They've always been watching me. Since I was born. Since before I was born. This is what my daddy saw over the house in Tupelo. This is what I saw in the woods when I was 8 years old. They're real. And they're trying to tell us something about where we're going as a species." Geller, who had approached the experience with scientific skepticism despite his spiritual beliefs, found himself unable to offer any rational explanation. They had both seen the same thing. The lights were real, and Elvis's conviction that he was somehow connected to whatever intelligence was operating those lights suddenly seemed far less crazy than it had before that night in the desert. What happened after the Arizona sighting was that Elvis's spiritual seeking intensified into something approaching obsession. He began purchasing every book he could find about UFOs, ancient astronauts, telepathy, astral projection, and contact with non-human intelligence. His personal library at Graceland eventually contained over 350 books on these subjects, many of them so obscure that even specialized bookstores had trouble tracking them down. Elvis read voraciously, often staying up all night studying texts about Ezekiel's wheel, Enoch's visions, the Vedic Vimanas described in ancient Hindu texts, and modern accounts of UFO encounters from credible witnesses including military pilots and government officials. He became particularly fascinated with the work of Erich von Däniken, whose book Chariots of the Gods proposed that ancient human civilizations had been visited and influenced by extraterrestrial beings. Larry Geller watched as Elvis's collection grew, sometimes receiving panicked phone calls at 2 in the morning because Elvis had just finished a book that raised questions he needed to discuss immediately. The king of rock and roll, who could have spent his nights partying with Hollywood stars, instead sat alone in his reading room at Graceland, surrounded by stacks of books about cosmic consciousness and extraterrestrial contact, trying to understand his place in a universe that he believed was far stranger and more wondrous than most people could imagine. Some of Elvis's closest associates found this behavior disturbing. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's ruthless manager, actively tried to keep Geller away from Elvis, viewing the spiritual advisor as a threat to his control. There were even incidents where books from Elvis's collection mysteriously disappeared, or were damaged, though nobody ever admitted to being responsible. Perhaps the most dramatic UFO encounter in Elvis's life occurred in 1974 at Graceland itself, witnessed by multiple people who had no reason to lie or fabricate stories. It was around midnight on a warm summer night, and Elvis was outside by the pool with several friends and bodyguards. The Memphis sky was clear, filled with stars, and Elvis was in a reflective mood, talking about his mother Gladys and how much he missed her guidance. Suddenly, one of the bodyguards pointed at the sky and asked what everyone was seeing. Hovering directly above Graceland, no more than a few hundred feet up, was a triangular craft with lights at each corner, completely silent, not moving at all. The group watched in stunned silence as this object remained stationary for several minutes, its lights pulsing in a rhythmic pattern that seemed almost like communication. Elvis stood up, walked to the center of the lawn, and simply stared at the craft, his arms at his sides, completely calm. According to witnesses who were there that night, Elvis appeared to be in some kind of trance or meditative state, as if he was mentally communicating with whatever intelligence was operating that craft. After about 5 minutes, the object's lights changed from a slow pulse to a rapid strobe, and then the craft moved away at incredible speed, vanishing in seconds. When Elvis finally turned back to his friends, he had tears in his eyes. He told them that he had felt a presence in his mind, a reassurance that he was on the right path, that his struggles and pain had purpose, and that he should continue seeking truth even when others thought he was losing his mind. While Elvis's spiritual seeking led him deep into meditation, mysticism, and UFO research, another passion was developing that was deeply connected in his mind: martial arts. In 1960, while stationed in Germany during his army service, Elvis had been introduced to karate, and he became obsessed with it. But his interest wasn't just about learning to fight or stay in shape. Elvis saw martial arts as a physical expression of the same spiritual principles he was studying in books about Eastern philosophy. The discipline, the focus, the idea of cultivating inner energy called chi or ki, the concept of harmony between mind and body, all of this resonated with Elvis's belief that human beings were capable of far more than Western culture acknowledged. When he returned to the United States, Elvis sought out the best martial arts instructors he could find, eventually meeting Ed Parker, the father of American Kenpo Karate, who would become one of the most important figures in Elvis's life. Ed Parker was more than just a karate instructor. He was a philosopher, a strategist, and someone who understood that martial arts were ultimately about spiritual development, not just physical combat. Parker recognized immediately that Elvis wasn't approaching karate as a hobby. The king of rock and roll was seeking something deeper, a practice that could help him integrate the mystical experiences and cosmic awareness he had been accumulating since childhood into a disciplined physical form. Under Parker's guidance, Elvis trained intensely, eventually earning a 7th-degree black belt in Kenpo Karate, and training in other martial arts systems including Taekwondo. He would spend hours at Graceland practicing forms, meditating in martial stances, and discussing with Parker how the principles of karate related to broader questions about consciousness, energy, and human potential. As Elvis's martial arts training progressed, strange things started happening that neither he nor his instructors could fully explain. During practice sessions at Graceland, witnesses reported seeing Elvis perform techniques with speed and power that seemed to exceed his physical conditioning. There were moments when his movements appeared almost supernaturally fast, when he seemed to anticipate attacks before they happened, when he demonstrated a level of awareness and reaction time that his instructors found remarkable. Elvis himself believed that his meditation practice combined with martial arts training was unlocking latent abilities that most humans never develop. He talked about feeling energy flowing through his body during forms, about moments of heightened awareness where time seemed to slow down, about sensing the intentions of training partners before they moved. Elvis began hosting secret martial arts demonstrations at Graceland, inviting other practitioners and occasionally performing for trusted friends. These weren't public exhibitions. Elvis didn't want media attention on this aspect of his life because he knew it would be sensationalized and misunderstood. These demonstrations were serious displays of skill, featuring complex forms, sparring sessions, and breaking techniques, but they were also spiritual experiences for Elvis. He saw each demonstration as an opportunity to prove to himself that the human body and mind were capable of extraordinary things when properly trained and when connected to deeper levels of consciousness. To understand Elvis Presley's spiritual worldview by the 1970s, you have to see how all these seemingly disparate interests connected in his mind. The UFO encounters weren't separate from his martial arts training. The meditation practice wasn't separate from his belief in extraterrestrial contact. Everything was part of a unified vision of reality in which human beings were on the verge of a massive evolutionary leap, guided by advanced civilizations from other worlds, and accessible through practices like meditation and martial arts that could unlock dormant human potential. Elvis believed that the beings of light who had visited him as a child were part of a network of advanced intelligences monitoring human development, occasionally making contact with individuals who could help prepare humanity for a future where we would take our place among cosmic civilizations. This wasn't just abstract philosophy for Elvis. He genuinely tried to live according to these beliefs, spending hours each day in meditation, studying texts from multiple religious and mystical traditions, training his body through martial arts, and constantly searching for new experiences that might bring him closer to understanding his place in this cosmic drama. Larry Geller watched as Elvis tried to reconcile his mundane life as an entertainer with his deep conviction that he was meant for something far more significant. Elvis would sometimes say that performing on stage felt like a distraction from his real work, which was spiritual development and preparation for whatever role the universe had assigned him. In the last year of his life, Elvis's spiritual practices became even more intense. He was reading multiple books simultaneously, filling notebooks with his thoughts about consciousness and cosmic purpose, and engaging in marathon meditation sessions that sometimes lasted 6 or 7 hours. Ed Parker noticed that Elvis's martial arts practice had become almost ritualistic, less about physical technique and more about entering altered states of consciousness through movement. Elvis told Parker that he could sometimes feel the presence of his twin brother Jesse during these sessions, as if the soul of his dead twin was finally communicating with him from another dimension. He also reported more frequent paranormal experiences at Graceland, lights appearing in his room at night, a sense of being watched by benevolent presences, dreams so vivid that he couldn't distinguish them from waking reality. During one conversation with Larry Geller just weeks before his death, Elvis said that he had finally made peace with not knowing exactly what his cosmic purpose was. He said that maybe the purpose was simply to search, to remain open to the mystery, to use whatever platform he had been given to inspire others to look beyond material success and ask bigger questions about existence. He talked about his music as a form of energy transmission, about performances as opportunities to create collective consciousness experiences with audiences, about fame as a kind of cosmic responsibility rather than a reward. On August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley was found dead in the bathroom at Graceland by his girlfriend Ginger Alden. The official cause of death was cardiac arrhythmia, though the autopsy revealed massive amounts of prescription drugs in his system. The world mourned the king of rock and roll, and over 50,000 fans gathered outside Graceland to pay their respects. But in the weeks and months after his death, something strange happened. Reports began circulating of Elvis sightings, people claiming to have seen him at gas stations, airports, grocery stores, always alive, always hiding, supposedly having faked his death to escape the pressures of fame. These sightings have continued for decades, becoming a persistent conspiracy theory. For those who knew about Elvis's beliefs in extraterrestrial contact and his conviction that he was part of a larger cosmic plan, the persistent rumors raised unsettling questions. Today, over 45 years after his death, Elvis Presley's spiritual legacy remains largely unknown to the millions of fans who visit Graceland every year. The tours focus on his music, his movies, his cars, and his jumpsuits. They don't mention the library of over 350 books about UFOs and mysticism. They don't discuss his conviction that he had been contacted by extraterrestrial intelligence. They don't explain his belief that martial arts training could unlock supernatural human abilities. But for those who knew Elvis personally, for those who spent hours with him discussing consciousness and cosmic purpose, for those who witnessed things with him that defied conventional explanation, the spiritual dimension of Elvis Presley's life was just as important as his music career. Larry Geller has spent decades since Elvis's death trying to share this aspect of the king's life, writing books and giving interviews about the profound spiritual seeker hiding behind the rhinestone jumpsuit. Ed Parker, before his own death in 1990, spoke about Elvis's martial arts journey and his belief that Elvis had achieved genuine spiritual breakthroughs through disciplined practice. Other witnesses to Elvis's UFO encounters have come forward over the years, corroborating the stories about strange lights and unexplained phenomena that followed Elvis throughout his life. Whether these experiences were objectively real, whether they were psychological phenomena, or whether they were something in between, the fact remains that Elvis Presley genuinely believed them, structured his life around them, and found meaning through them even as other aspects of his life fell apart. The story of Elvis Presley's spiritual journey leaves us with a question. What do we make of someone who has experiences that fall outside the boundaries of accepted reality? Elvis saw beings of light when he was 8 years old, and those beings showed him a future that actually came true. He witnessed unexplained objects in the sky multiple times, along with credible witnesses. He dedicated thousands of hours to meditation, spiritual study, and martial arts training. He collected hundreds of books on subjects that mainstream science dismisses but that millions of people worldwide believe deserve serious investigation. And through it all, Elvis maintained a consistent conviction that his life was connected to something far larger than entertainment, something cosmic in scope. The people who knew him best say that despite his flaws, despite his addiction and his sometimes erratic behavior, Elvis possessed an authentic spiritual hunger and humility that is rare in people who achieve his level of fame. He never claimed to have all the answers. He never started a cult or declared himself a prophet. He simply searched, constantly and desperately, for understanding about experiences that began the night he was born under a strange blue light in Tupelo, Mississippi. And maybe that's the real legacy of Elvis's spiritual journey. Not that he found definitive answers about UFOs and cosmic consciousness, but that he never stopped asking questions, never stopped seeking, never allowed fame and success to convince him that material reality was all that existed. If Elvis Presley could speak to us now, 45 years after his death, what would he say about his cosmic journey? Based on his conversations with those closest to him in his final years, he would probably say that the search itself was the point, that asking questions about consciousness and the cosmos is what makes us truly human, that refusing to accept materialistic explanations as the final word about reality is an act of courage. He would say that his music was always meant to be more than entertainment, that performance was his way of trying to create moments of transcendence for audiences. He would acknowledge that he didn't find all the answers, that many of his questions remained unresolved when he died, but that the search gave his life meaning even when everything else seemed empty. The king of rock and roll left us his music, But he also left us this deeper gift: permission to seek, to question, to believe that reality might be stranger and more wonderful than we dare to imagine. And maybe that's the ultimate legacy of the boy from Tupelo, who was born under a mysterious blue light and spent his entire life trying to understand what it meant.